Hello, Reactathon. Thanks for joining me today, and big thanks to Ben for having me. I remember when I had my flights booked for San Francisco in March 2020. It feels like 20 years ago, but I'm really excited that we could all meet virtually today. So I'm excited to share some ideas about building React apps with internationalization, or I-18N, in mind. And my name is Naomi Meyer. I work as a software development engineer at Adobe on the globalization team, where I handle internationalization engineering for a variety of Creative Cloud products like Adobe Fonts, Adobe Portfolio, and Behance. So this is where you can find me online. If there's anything you feel passionately about, please let me know. I would really love to continue the conversation online. So when we're talking about internationalization, what are we talking about? This is the Center for Disease Control, the CDC website, and this is the English version of the website. If we internationalize and look at the Japanese version, the Spanish version of the website, we can see some differences. So, of course, all of the text and strings have been translated into Spanish. A few other things to note is we have a different URL or a different language route, and oftentimes the app is bundled and served into production with different language routes or different builds for each different language. Also search. We can search across multiple languages and return language-specific search results. In the English version of the app, we saw that this button was a lot shorter. So here the button is longer, and with internationalization, we have a flexible layout for the different languages and different lengths of text. Also, on the bottom there, we can see a calendar. So all dates, times, calendars, currencies, locations where numbers are displayed in an app need to be formatted and handled correctly for different languages. So these are kind of the things that we're going to go over today and get more in depth on in the context of internationalization. So that's kind of our agenda. First, we're going to start with some examples to get our minds thinking internationally. Then we'll go over some definitions to kind of level set and make sure we're all on the same page. Then we'll spend most of our time talking about implementation. We'll go over a React demo with a few different open source tools available. And then we'll talk about the JavaScript Intl Api. And we'll go into some design and UX considerations. And finally, we'll end on cultural considerations. And overall, my goal for today is to invite you all, my fellow React developers, to really join me in my mission and put the world in the World Wide Web. So to start and get our minds thinking about the full World Wide Web, let's use an example. So, a few minutes ago when I started, I said, hello, my name is Naomi Meyer. I use the English as spoken in the US syntax where I define myself by my first name or given name, followed by my last name, family name, or surname. But if we take this simple string, hello, my name is Naomi Meyer, and we translate it into Japanese, Hindi, Hebrew, Arabic, Korean, and Chinese, we can see a wide variety of difference, right? Where I have first name highlighted in blue and last name highlighted in purple. Sometimes in certain languages, people define themselves by first name, last name. Sometimes the syntax is different and it's last name, first name. Sometimes the text is reading left to right. Sometimes the text is reading right to left. And of course, we have different fonts, different scripts, different alphabets. And this is essential in the context of internationalization to ensure that a user can enter their name or, create a new user account with their name. Because if a user is entering their name and it's being displayed incorrectly, they're going to have a negative user experience. And, this is your users, this is your customers' unique identifier. And that's why it's so important to get this right to make an app really serve a global audience. So this is an example of a form of a Google account where that first name, last name paradigm is followed. So this is kind of a one way to do it. But another way to do it, and this is from Twitter form, where instead of following that first name, last name kind of English, American bias, there's just a name field. And that's where a user can enter their name in their native language, and it will be displayed in the way that they would like it to be displayed. And so this is, I think, a great way to do it. So with that in mind, let's go over some definitions just to kind of level set and make sure we're all on the same page. So this is sort of the paradigm that we often talk about, where we have the first sort of basic component of translation, or T9N. And these are all numeric acronyms, right, where we take T for the first character, and then N for the last character in the word, and then the number of letters between those. So T9N is translation, and translation is where hello becomes hola, konnichiwa, bonjour. Then we have localization. And localization, a good way to remember it is in, English in the US, we spell localization with a Z or a Z. But if we go across the pond in the UK, it's going to be spelled with an S in London. And those are different locales or regional dialectic variations of the English language. And so part of the process of localization is we take that into consideration. There's Spanish in Mexico and Spanish in Spain, French in Canada, French in France, and all of these different locales or regional dialects are considered in building the app. And then the sort of next level up of granularity is internationalization, and that's where we prepare the app and we make everything ready to be translated. And so that's very engineering heavy category. And these all fall under the umbrella of globalization. And globalization also often includes sort of non-engineering business units like sales and legal and marketing and how those vary across different regions. But we're not going to get into those today. But the more I kind of look at this paradigm and I think about it, I feel like there's sort of an additional higher order component that these all fall under. And for me, I think these fall under really accessibility and innovation, because culture is deeply rooted in our thinking patterns, and it affects how users interact with and benefit from different digital experiences. So I think internationalization really goes way beyond translation. And by acknowledging different cultural characteristics and celebrating the differences, we are creating with innovation. So another reason why this is so important is because if we look at these two charts, they kind of tell a different story. The bar chart shows clearly that the majority of people on Earth do not speak English as their first language, whereas the pie chart shows that the majority of digital content online on the World Wide Web is in English. So I look at this and I think this is a big opportunity for us to improve and expand digital content to different languages. So let's talk about how we can do that, and let's talk about internationalization with React. So here is a simple example of a button, and these examples, I have them deployed on StackBlitz. If you want to follow along in the GitHub link there, or if you want to play around with the code deployed on StackBlitz, there's the links. But here's a simple button that says, click this button. So this is kind of an example of what I would call a hard-coded English string. So what we can do is we can take that click this button and we can wrap it in a formatted message. And this example of the formatted message defines an ID, and here we have the ID as components.example.button, and we have a default message called click this button. And what we do is we take that formatted message ID and we can extract it into a separate resource file. And here's an EN English in the US.json file, and we have the ID that was previously defined in the button, and that's the key. And the value is the translated string associated with that key. And so if we have a French.json file, click this button would then be in French. And we can build out all of these different resource files for each of the distinct locales that are supported within the app. And that's kind of the basic process. So these examples are using the React Intl tool, but I want to shout out that there are lots of amazing open source libraries. Format.js creates React Intl, and that's the one I'm most familiar with. That's the one I use at work. But there's also other open source projects. These are four that are, highly regarded, well-maintained, have a lot of good reviews. I18Next, Lingui, I'm not sure if I'm saying that right, apologies. And Alibaba has the React Intl Universal Library. So people often ask me, well, what open source library should I use? What tools should I use within a React context? And I really recommend folks go out and do their own research, because different libraries have different features and different benefits. And the unique architecture of your React app is going to make a difference. So things to consider are whether you have a monorepo or a monolith, whether you're using TypeScript or not, your CI/CD pipeline, and what kind of needs you have in terms of translation. So great tools. Pick one, and here's a few ways that we can implement these different tools. So we saw the example button. Here's an example component where we're importing a formatted message from React Intl. And similar to the default message that was click this button, we have a default message here, but this default message is special because it includes pluralization. And I want to call this out because in many languages, plural forms vary, right? It's not just about adding an S or not like we have in English. Oftentimes a 0, 1, or other value of a plural form can really vary and be a completely different word in certain languages. So if a string includes a plural form, it's good to have all those different values separated. So here we have a formatted message with a default message with the different plural forms, and that's exported as the example component. So here's a similar example, but this is from the Linguino open source library. And a few things to call out here. Instead of the formatted message that we saw from React Intl, here we have the trans tool that's being imported, and for translate. And then we're returning an H1 with trans for translate, and in the footer we have the trans separated out. Also, there's the plural form, and this is kind of similar to what we saw with React Intl, but instead we have the value as messages count, the one value and the other value. And if you want to get fancy with it, we also have a custom hook available in Linguino. So here's the use Linguini, or I keep saying it wrong. My apologies. Use Lingui custom hook, and then in the footer we can do i18n.date and utilize that i18n date formatting. And date formatting is really essential, and we're going to get into more date examples later on. And here's the i18 next custom hook with use translation, returning the translated welcome to React string. We can also have a higher order component implementation, and this is exporting default the with translation higher order component, exporting my component, and this is another great way to do it. We can also render the prop and wrap the string in a translation tool. And the reason why I'm going through all of these is because I personally, and I don't care how you do it, what I'm most interested in is that you go out and do it. Wrap your string in something that will translate your string, and that something isn't as important as just actually doing it and translating all of these strings and wrapping them in something that will send them out for translation. So after you've wrapped your strings in a wrapper tool, the next step is to configure your app. So here's a simple example of configuring with React Intl, where we import the Intl provider, and then we pass in the Intl provider around the app function. And this is a really simple example with Create React App. Here's another example with the Lingui tool, where we're loading the messages from a resource file of, en for English /messages, and then we can pass or activate that messages file within the i18n provider at the app. So pretty similar, but we're just importing the messages file directly. And then the ITnext version, this is creating a separate configuration file where you can configure your unique linting and other parameters required for your distinct app, and then load your resource files either directly there or in an extracted format. So wrap your strings in a wrapper and configure them so that they can be loaded. But the question I often get is, well, how do we get and set our users locale? And again, there's a lot of ways to do it, but I encourage you to consider the example of a person who's sitting in a New York City public library and might be browsing in the US IP address, but the computer language in the library might be set to Spanish, and the user actually speaks Korean. So consider these examples and distinct, use cases. So the recommendation from Unicode is to always, always, always let the user decide and change their language. So it's good to put the language setting up in the header or in the footer in a place that's easy to find and where the user can change their language on each page. Because often we found that multilingual users will view one page in one language and then want to read about it in a different language just to make sure that they understand the different language context. So make the language setting easy to find, let the user change their language, and let that happen on each different page. And I said this recommendation comes from Unicode, so you might be asking, what's Unicode? Well, that's a whole nother talk, and I have a few talks. You can check them out on my website. But Unicode is kind of like the governing body for internationalization. The Unicode Consortium is a nonprofit group started in 1991, and they encode all characters across all languages on all devices and operating systems in the world. So they're really exciting to read about if this sparks your interest. And Unicode also creates the ICU, the international components for Unicode, for technical components, and CLDR, the Common Locale Data Repository, and they do a lot of great stuff. So if you're interested, definitely check them out. But any conversation about internationalization of software can't happen without talking about Unicode. So another thing that Unicode recommends, and that has kind of become one of my pet peeves lately, is do not use flags to represent language or locales on a website. If you have a language changer, because many languages are spoken in many countries, and many countries speak multiple languages. So instead, you can use region or language. So here is an example from adobe.com where you can select your region. And another thing to call out here is that the language is defined in that native language, in that native script. And, I'm not typing out Japanese in English, I'm typing out Japanese in Japanese so that that user can then easily find their language. So with that in mind, let's move on to the JavaScript Intl API. And I think that this is amazing because there's a lot of really great stuff directly in the JavaScript Intl API that's available, out of the box with JavaScript. You don't need to load additional libraries that could negatively impact performance. And I think a lot of people forget that a lot of the date and time and number formatting can happen directly with the Intl object. So big shout out there. So here's a few examples. First, we can create a reusable formatter instance of passing in a locale and a number. So here we're using the intl.numberFormat method, and then we're formatting a number, this really long number of 123 trillion plus. And if we look at it across languages, we can see some variety, right? Which I love. So in English, there's a comma every third integer. German, there's a period. Russian, there's a space. And then in Tamil and Hindi, the comma is included at a different location. So they have different number ordering systems. And this is something to keep in mind because we know that words are different in different languages, but numbers are also different and need to be handled correctly. So here's that same intl.number format, but here we're passing in that optional parameter of notation as compact. So if we look at the compact notation, we can see the same number but shortened. So English has 123 plus trillion. And then we see the locale-specific symbol for all these different languages and all these different formattings. So instead of just hard coding and displaying a number in your app, you can use JavaScript and format it for each distinct locale. Also, dates. So the age-old question, what day is it? This is either February 1st or January 2nd, depending on where you're asking, you know, in the mysterious 2021 when things will be better, hopefully. So if we take this same date, we can use the intl object, and here's we're using the date time format. And there's a lot of tools available in here. This is just one example where we can format a range. So we're passing in a start date and an end date, and then we can see that represented across locales. So January 2nd to February 1st, across a wide variety of locales, and we can see, I think it's beautiful that there's such a distinct variety. So let's move on to talk about design and UX. So one of the biggest challenges that we often see in internationalization is we need to allow for expansion of UI elements to accommodate translated text. So a good rule of thumb to follow, and this is from Adobe's design system called Spectrum, that if an English text is less than 10 characters, allow a 300% expansion. But if an English text is greater than 10 characters, a 30% expansion is required. But we have tools for this, right? We have CSS Grid, we have Flexbox. We know how to have flexible layouts for different responsive design, you know, on phone and computer, but we can apply that same logic to different lengths of language text. Also, font size and emphasis. So italics and bold do not register in Chinese, Japanese, Korean fonts. And then certain fonts require significantly larger size to be legible. And colors. Colors can have different meanings across certain cultures. So this is an example of an Adobe stock price app where +8 is in red in the Japanese version of the app because in parts of East Asia, red is a color associated with joy and happiness. Whereas in the English version, that is represented in green because in the West, red is a color associated with danger and, you know, error messaging. So let's move on to talk a bit about cultural considerations. So this is an example of if I go into your app and I search for holiday images, will I see a Chinese New Year, Ramadan, Passover, Christmas, Diwali, the Fall Light Festival? These are all holidays, and they're all important holidays in different cultural settings. But do we always think about them with our language bias and our cultural bias? And how can we build apps to enable all of these different cultures to see their own holiday? Similarly, if we search for delicious food, what images do you think of in your mind? What images do you see if you search for food in different languages? You know, is it sushi, burritos, pizza, dumplings, curry? These are all delicious foods. And I look at them and I think that many of us would agree that having a variety is very important and delicious and good. And, you know, sometimes spicy, sometimes sweet. This wide variety of foods makes the world delicious, right? And many of us would be unhappy eating only one bland, same food forever. So I ask, why are we building apps with just one language when we can expand to tackle all of the delicious foods and delicious cultures and languages around the world? This is a map from UNESCO on linguistic diversity, and each dot represents a language that is endangered on Earth. And I think by enabling different languages and different language users to really use and navigate our apps in their native mother tongues, it's good for the world. So please join me and put the world in the World Wide Web. Thank you so much. Let's continue the conversation online.